Welcome to the Emblazers, the show for B2B Leaders Igniting Revenue. I'm your host, Amanda DeVlugt, part of the Emblaze Insights community, and I'm joined by the Patrick Mahomes of messaging and methodology, Tim Riesterer. He's also our Chief Strategy Officer here at Emblaze. Tim, it's always great to see you
Yeah. Oh, to be that young and agile and athletic again. That would be
and have
awesome. But
that many commercials under your belt and play
yeah,
football.
right. Play a game for a living. So some may think that's what we're doing here, but this is serious
No,
business.
this is very serious. In fact, it's so serious. We talked to author Ted McKenna today, all around the JOLT effect and indecision. Uh, really insightful research that he shared. What were some of the things that you were most excited to hear about from him?
Well, I think I used to call this no decision, which made it sound so final. And now we're saying indecision, which means it's just a temporary state. And maybe there
Hmm.
are some nudges we can do to get them to a decision instead of this thing flaming out completely. So what I appreciated is he had some very specific, very practical, very I could do this tomorrow ideas. If you listen close, to move somebody from indecision to a decision and maybe pick a few of those off instead of leaving all that on the table.
Yeah, some really good insights to take a listen to. Get ready for an exciting episode with Ted McKenna. He's a true powerhouse in the world of sales and business development. In fact, he's the co author of the groundbreaking book, The JOLT Effect: How High Performers Overcome Customer Indecision. And in just a couple months, his highly anticipated book, The Activator Advantage: What Rainmakers Today Do Differently, is going to also be coming out. Ted has captivated audiences around the globe with his insights around sales, business development, and customer experience. He's also the co founder and CEO of Selling Innovations, where he leads the charge in providing research based training, enablement, and advisory support for B2B commercial organizations. The list goes on, and I don't really know when Ted sleeps because he seems like he has his hand in the pot all over the place. Ted, it is so great to see you. Welcome to the Emblazers show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, I want to get under the hood of what this JOLT effect is, especially if we've got some listeners. It's their first time hearing this acronym and what that means, and how that's going to help sales leaders equip their sales teams on the nuances of indecision. So, I know we've got some really good conversation between you and Tim. But right off the bat, I want to ask you a question here. The JOLT effect flips the traditional sales wisdom like completely on its head. Can you give us like a quick summary of what the JOLT effect is, and maybe one piece of sales advice that now you consider to either be outdated or harmful after your research?
Yeah.
Ted, sorry, I'm just going to go, give me a J, and then you do J, and then give me an O. Never mind.
Got
You
it.
just do what you
No,
got to do.
that's fine. I can adjust as needed. You just call out what you need me to get to, and I can. Yeah. So thanks again for having me. A couple years ago, Matt Dixon and I, my co-author, Matt and I, were nerds. So at the beginning of the pandemic, we could think of nothing better to do than to engage in a big study. But actually, it turned out to be a good time for us as researchers because what we took is a bunch of call recordings. It turned out to be 2.5 million in total. And we had access to that many in part because it was the beginning of the pandemic. And if you remember, sales overnight went from in person in coffee shops around the world to everyone on Zoom or Teams. And these are now recordings we could take and study at scale in ways we never could have previously. And one of the first things we found that was surprising was that all these losses occurring in places we wouldn't have expected. So we found 40 to 60% of deals are lost to no decision. And a big portion of those were coming in places that were really quite surprising to us. So it felt like there were times when the buyer was very excited to move forward. They had some degree of intent to purchase. They might have even the seller might have been one selection. Like if they're going to buy from anyone, they're going to buy from that company. And the seller was doing all the things you would have expected and wanted them to do to create this burning platform for change and help the buyer understand all the reasons to move forward. And they were still getting stuck, still stalling out. And that's what really kind of caught our attention and sent us down this study of what turned into around customer indecision. Now, the first big finding there was in those moments when the buyer stalls out. And then again, typically this happens after it feels like the buyer has some degree of intent to purchase. At that point, when the buyer starts to stall out, most sellers misdiagnose that situation. They miss the reason for it. They assume that the hesitation is rooted in a lack of persuasion. Their assumption is the buyer must not want it enough, even though they're saying that they want it, even though it appears they must not, because if they were, they'd be showing up to these calls,
Hmm.
right? Or they'd be answering my emails, or these terms that they're concerned about ought not be that big a concern. And so they go back to the well and try to relitigate that case. And that ends up backfiring. 84% of the time, it makes things worse, not better. That was the big finding. And so the thing that for us was a real shock was that buyer's the buyer's desire to move forward is different and distinct from the fear that pops up when they start to grapple with what comes next. And so for the seller, the thing we need to be really careful of, and to answer your question in a long-winded way, is we need to be really careful about in those situations when the buyer is really worried about messing up and not so much about whether I want this or not, to not take that already fearful buyer and throw a lot more fear on top of it. It ends up stalling out more often than not.
Mm. So we've been doing some research in this area of escalation of commitment, and as someone moves further and further in the process, they're less likely to appreciate you coming in and disrupting it and trying to tell them something new. And like you said, I love your words, relitigate that. That in
Yep.
fact it becomes sort of a more of a, so let's say it becomes less about a loss frame or loss aversion that caused them to think they should now move, to now they're worried that if they move they're going to lose something,
Yep.
and you have to change your tactic at that point. That we found that now all of a sudden the gain frame, like what's possible to gain, is more powerful than the loss frame once they've escalated their commitment. Does that make
Yep.
sense, and is that resonating?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, we saw all these instances in the study. We could see them happening where they were losing, but we couldn't really understand why it was happening. So like you guys at Corporate Visions, we like to also take inspiration from what social science tells us is happening there too. And you're referencing a very powerful phenomenon around prospect theory and loss aversion and the effect it has on how we make decisions. But there's a part of the research that Kahneman and Tversky did that for us helped to explain what might be happening here, which is that error of commission is a big part of what the buyer is worried about, which is I might do something or I have done something in the past. And when that happens and it goes wrong, I get blamed for it. So they start worrying less about I'm missing out on whether the upside gain of your potential sale or fixing this problem you just talked about, but rather if I go to do this and it goes wrong, people start pointing fingers. And I care about my job more than I do about your 10% discount or fixing this one problem. Yeah, so their calculation absolutely changes as they started to worry more about what comes next.
It's worse in B2B. Like as a regular consumer, you and I, we can make a bad decision and like that's on us. And we can sweep that one under the rug. You make a bad decision in B2B and you have the team that was making the decision, you then have all the ramifications. So the anticipation of regret, I like to say, has now moved to the anticipation of blame, and that's way worse, way worse.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, there's inside bigger organizations, right? There's even more political clout or situations I need to account for. I don't know that I think your point on the personal side that may depend on maybe who you're married to or who your friends are, and or just your general
They never let you
situation.
forget it.
No, but I think your point is like, look, the reason, and I talk about this a lot. Um, we were quite curious actually about hey, there are things that affect us as individuals when you go to buy something on Amazon, for example, but does it affect people in the same way when they're spending other people's money in a B2B context and they have their careers to worry about and their paychecks to worry about? But I think your broader point is they're also making very consequential, very visible decisions that they'll have to live with for years. Like if I buy something on Amazon, it doesn't work out, wasted money and I look like an idiot, but I'll move on, in a day. But not so much if I'm implementing this thing for the next 2 years.
Guys, you had me at Amazon, but I want to take a step back for just a second. Ted, can you really walk us through like the acronym of JOLT? Like what does what do those letters actually mean and represent in this
Yeah.
in this methodology?
All right, so we're holding up the J now. There's a
Yes.
sign. Imagine a J. Yes.
Tim should
So
be wearing his cheerleading
No,
outfit, but he forgot
I get
it.
YMCA, but I'm not sure how to do JOLT. So we'll work on it.
so JOLT is an acronym. It stands for the 4 key behaviors that we found in our study that high performers do differently to help buyers in what we'll call cold feet moments, where they start to get that hesitation. But it's also has double meanings. We're trying to jolt customers into action, jolt them past their indecision. So the J in the JOLT, it stands for judging indecision, trying to judge the level of indecision. And this requires us to understand the size and depth and breadth of indecision, which is more than just, can this organization make a purchase? Do they want it enough? Is there budget, authority, all that good stuff? We should continue qualifying or disqualifying on those criteria. The JOLT seller adds a second dimension, which is, can they ever even make a decision at all? And if not, I might need to think about reprioritizing my time, reforecasting based on how fast or how likely they are to make a decision. But then in doing this, I'll also learn a little bit about the type of indecision that they have, which will help me with the next part of the playbook. The problem, though, that a lot of sellers run into with the J or with indecision in general is that buyers either aren't aware or aren't always willing to fully admit that they're experiencing indecision. So it's kind of beneath the surface, and they got to find ways to surface that throughout the purchase. So that's the J.
Give me an O.
The O. All right. So the O is offering recommendation. So as I mentioned, when we go to understand that size, depth, and breadth of indecision, there's 3 big fears that the buyer has about messing up. And the first big one is about options overload. So even after they've made a decision to move forward, they look at this sea of options and all these choices they have to make about implementation and onboarding and integrations, data migration, all these things that are decisions these buyers have to make. And the buyers struggle because they all seem kind of right. They struggle with trade-offs, like, do I do this one first, this one first? I don't know, so I'll just wait it out. So a JOLT seller offers a firm recommendation, and in doing so, they signal to that buyer that they're shifting a little bit of that perceived blame from the buyer to the seller. I'm sharing in that choice with you, right? This is my recommendation for you to move forward. The problem that a lot of sellers run into, a lot of organizations run into, is that we're overly deferential to buyers. Actually, the data, it's really interesting. The data shows that the more indecisive the buyer gets, the more deferential we get. So we're actually less likely to make recommendations when we detect indecision. It needs to be the opposite. So our first assumption is, far be it from me, Mr. and Mrs. Customer, to tell you what to do. Let's go back, Tim, to the reason you started down this path, and we'll use that as inspiration for which direction to go in. And for the buyer, all it feels like is you just foisted it right back onto them, sort of the opposite of that recommendation. So that's the O, quick version.
L.
Why do I feel like he started this whole thing just to make the L on the forehead?
Right now, just so I can just mimic
It's really,
and
we
make a
planned
mockery
this.
of myself.
He was too excited for the L.
Right,
Yeah.
like I didn't even hear what you just said, Ted. I want to get to L.
So the L is about limiting the exploration. So the second big challenge that buyers have, the big fear they have, is that they lack information, which is a little counterintuitive, because how could buyers lack information in this information-rich environment? It's all over the place. But for the buyer, they feel like, because there's so much information out there, it's my job, it's my duty to make sure I understand all of it before I feel like I'm ready to move forward, that I'm a fully informed purchaser. And so they don't yet feel like they've done enough homework. The JOLT seller is capable of helping that buyer by limiting the exploration to healthy rather than excessive levels. We can't just ask them to stop asking questions, right? So there's going to be some diligence involved with this, but the JOLT seller is finding ways to show that buyer that I can be a trusted expert along the way, that I've been down this path before, you're in good hands. So there's a couple of tactics involved there. And then finally, the T. We've arrived at the T. There you go.
I'm going to call timeout T, right? Yeah.
That's right. This is a 20-second timeout. So the T is about taking risk off the table. So the third big challenge that buyers have, the big fear they have about messing up, is that outcomes remain too uncertain. These are those buyers that no amount of assurance seems like enough. They feel like, hey, yeah, look, all the case studies you gave me are great. All the reference calls I've done are pretty good, but we're going to be the one exception. And we stink at change. We're going to mess this up, right? So everything feels uncertain, too many moving variables and pieces and whatnot. So in those situations, we have to find ways to both set expectations for that buyer about what's practical and believable. And sometimes we may have to offer some form of safety net. some way to kind of de-risk that decision for that buyer, lest we can't be surprised if it gets stuck late stage.
So talk to me a little bit about this, because when we're at late stage, right, indecision starting to show up maybe mid and later stage. Otherwise, you wouldn't know it's indecision yet. You're still trying to figure out if it's an opportunity. But now you know it's an opportunity. All the signals are there for an opportunity. It's stuck. My assumption is at that point, at least in a B2B sale, that now executives start showing up in the decision-making process. We know that like 85% of every B2B deal requires a VP or higher level sign-off. And my question is, when you look at the JOLT, there's a lot of emotion still tied up in those,
Yep.
maybe dealt with in a way that's not quite as disruptive as it is on the front end, but it's still emotion management. But now you got executives in the picture who act like they're emotionless. Yet this thing, this thing is stuck. How do you account for the executive buyer and the business case they say they need and JOLT?
Yeah, it's really interesting, actually. That rational sort of senior executive that never has emotion just doesn't exist, and it's hard to weed through it if you're the average seller, because often they're like the CFO who is asking for those ROI assumptions, and so we sort of assume, well, it's the rational business case is all I need there, and we miss a lot of signs that are hidden in there. One thing I might just note is that you can start detecting indecision even early on, and the baggage they bring into these decisions from past situations, the political clout they're afraid to lose. These are things we could pick up on early discovery, even if, to your point, early on, my main job is to make sure they want that change. And it's also true that it's going to become more evident and explicit as we get into later stages. And you're also right that part of that is because more people come into the decision at that point. To get to your question about executive buyers, the misstep that a lot of sellers run into here is, one, they assume, there's actually two of them. One is they assume that senior person isn't indecisive because they are so senior and they must be so rational. And we lose sight of the fact that these people make very consequential, very visible decisions, and they struggle with indecision just as much as anyone else. When you make these very consequential decisions, your worry about being blamed is going to rise, which is the root of that indecision. And the second thing is, we don't actually spend enough time with these folks. We don't actually get access to them. We don't even try to get access to them. And as a consequence, it leaves this huge blind spot around indecision of the buying group.
So breaking news, executives have emotion.
That's right. Yes.
They're people too.
Exactly
Okay.
right. They
All
are
right.
humans.
Okay, that question is answered on my checklist. Thank you.
All right, I will now befriend them. One of the things that I think that really comes across from this, losing battle because it's really expensive, losing battle if you can't deal with I'll call it the rabbit in the middle of the python. No.
There you go. Like
and so it becomes more of a discussion about pipeline health and being able to diagnose quickly that you're running into indecision, and then being able to intervene in a meaningful way before that thing like has a chance to atrophy. So how do you recommend that sellers and their managers spot this soon enough and can run the JOLT play?
Well, I wouldn't lose sight first that part of cleaning up that pipeline could be doing some disqualification too, of getting some of that. If there's somebody who has high dysfunction or high indecision that aren't ever going to get to a decision, I'd rather disqualify that early. But of course, we spin wheels for way too long, months and months of work for us and for our buyers. As we look to observe that, we talk to sales teams about two things. First, we've got to understand, what does it sound like, when somebody is indecisive? What are the signs of it so I can listen better for it? The tricky part there for most sellers is that indecision is often cloaked in really positive statements, like, everything you guys do is amazing, or I'd love another demo. I'd love to bring more people in. It sounds like engagement and activity, but what it indicates actually is that they're not sure which direction to move in, or they don't feel yet they've done enough homework, or other things they're trying to cover off in terms of assurance. And so we need to understand where that's coming from and spot that under the surface, which speaks to the second skill. We talked to sales teams about the skill we call pings and echoes, and it takes inspiration from sonar about how the battleship looks for submarines underneath the water. They're using pings as a way to understand the size and depth of what's under there, in the same way that a seller might too. The echo that comes back from that buyer tells me a lot about the size and shape of that indecision. And so what the ping essentially does is articulate the fear that that buyer might be experiencing at that moment. You're trying to get that elephant out into the room and have that comfortable conversation about, hey, I'm sensing that you're kind of feeling in this way, or, I wonder if a lot of buyers at this juncture often feel this way. Am I off base there? And you're just trying to give them a sense for, hey, let's have that candid discussion about how you might be feeling at this point. And so it's both about listening and, we can't assume it's not there just because we're not hearing it. So that's where we got to move into active sonar.
I like that answer. What I really like about that is this idea that even when you hear the customer asking for more things that make it sound like the deal's making progress, if you listen closely, they're asking for more things because they're stuck and they can't make a decision. And you asking quickly and confidently what might be the source of this next ask is a realistic and appropriate thing for a seller to do.
So tough though, right? Because we've been there before. Sorry, Amanda. Just real quick, the seller wants to update that CRM or give their manager an update, and it's like, oh, thank God they're asking for something, and so they want to dive back in.
Right.
I find this so fascinating. I'm sort of reflecting on personal conversations I've had with my spouse now. These masked phrases and why like some things have not gotten done around the house. But anyway, that's for a different story. Ted, you've obviously studied. I'm going to get personal here for a second. You've studied indecision deeply for a lot of your career. I'm really curious. Do you find yourself more decisive or not because of the science that you now know?
Well, so I think the answer is usually not. There's some tricks of the trade I've started to learn. Like when I go to restaurants, I'll usually ask the waiter or the waitress for one or two options rather than like, hey, what's good here? And then let them sort of flounder as they start to go through the whole menu. But generally speaking, no. In fact, I joke about this all the time. Just the fact that I know what drives it, you would think would prevent me from experiencing this, but it turns out that's not true. And I do experience it all the time. The example I often provide is, you guys know what the Remarkable tablet is? You've seen ads for that. It's like a digital tablet. It's supposed to be like an iPad equivalent, like writing on paper is their whole thing. And every single time I see one of those ads, I mean, their marketing team probably hates me because, or I mean, they might love me. I don't know. Because every time I see the ad, I click on it because I'm like, oh, I'm going to take such great notes. I'll be so focused. And then it comes up, and then I wonder, you know what? I'm not going to actually use this. Like, my kids already make fun of me for all sorts of technology things. Like, they don't need another thing. So I close it down. And I swear to God, I've been evaluating that purchase for like 2 years, and it's just, I haven't done it yet.
And so what
I feel like I know what we need to send you for Christmas, Ted.
Well, right. Like, just somebody's got to make this call for him, which I think brings up a good point. Like, you're trying to do this as a self-service buyer. And so now let's bring this back to the B2B world. Like, the ultimate thing here could be, what if there was a salesperson to help you get over the hump? Sounds like you could actually use a salesperson, Ted, instead of 100%. Trying to make this decision.
I could absolutely, yes, yeah. No, look, this is.
I have a good book you can read.
That's right. No, it's like, listen, you're making a funny point, but it's so true. Like, you can see in our data, the buyer absolutely needs our help for these things, and I guess in this case, am the buyer. So yeah, I'll take a seller anytime I can get it.
Well, I think that's good news for our audience. It's good news for us at the Emblazers because we're talking to sales leaders and sales leaders trying to still develop human talent to do what humans are good at. And it sounds like helping someone overcome indecision is probably still not the domain for AI to take over. That is the distinct space that humans can occupy. And we'll all appreciate that as AI does some things, there's going to be some things that we just have to master. And getting people over indecision sounds like one of those things that everybody needs to master if you're going to be a top performing seller moving forward.
Absolutely.
That's all I got, Amanda. Human that sellers should be leaning into to continue to find ways to add value to the B2B buying decision.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it's interesting you mention AI because, on the one hand, AI is going to allow buyers to get even more prescriptive, I suppose, in terms of their choices, but it's going to go to make recommendations. And the question is, how much are they going to trust those recommendations? And I think the seller, the place where they really shine is in using sort of empathy as a way to build a little bit of that trust. And I don't see it, soon in the future that some sort of AI bot is going to be able to convey that trust and show that buyer that they have their best interests in mind. And so that's at least one that I look to. Setting expectations requires a lot of context. That's a key. In fact, in our predictive model, we had 8,000 plus variables. Expectation setting was the number one most powerful skill. And that feels like a very human thing. There's a lot of context you have to understand, and there's nuance in some ways about how you go to deliver it. Now, when we break it down in our training, there's specific skills you can kind of work on to get better. But nonetheless, it requires the human, not to overuse the word, to translate a fair amount of information from what's going on in the buyer's environment, what's going on inside that company, and what's helpful for that person at the same time, and then use that as a way to set those expectations in a way that feels better for the individual. And so, look, I could be proven wrong, but for me, that feels like a pretty human skill.
A lot of opportunity yet, folks, to add value to the buyer, and in particular, to get them over the hump to a decision. Gartner calls it the value affirming skills. So I'm going to just kind of go with that for now, that we all got to be best at the value affirming skills that really only humans can deliver. Thanks, Ted. Been a pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ted. This has been great. Tim, we just talked to Ted, McKenna, all around the JOLT effect. I'm jolted by what he was talking about on indecision. You, as, the Hemingway of messaging, what was your take on the discussion? Ted talking about indecision and how to overcome that.
Well, what I appreciate is that sometimes in a sales cycle, when all hope seems lost and you start getting ghosted and things seem like, they went off the rails, there's still hope. There's still an opportunity. And so what I appreciated is the concept of JOLT says, keep hope alive. It was very insightful.